we're going to get started here and continue to eat and have dessert. And feel free to get up if you want something else. If you need to use the restroom, that's just fine to move around as well. So I'm going to get started. So I began my sermon today talking about the importance of remembering our shared story. And as we mark 200 years as a church, it is indeed important for us, I think, to pause to remember our story. Today I'll be talking about our origin story and how we came to be constituted on April 29th, 1826. First of all, an interesting little tidbit about July 4th, 1826, which was just 2 months after we were formed. Anybody know it happened on July 4th, 1826?
John Adams, for my word.
That's right. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, on the 4th of July of 1826. Just 2 months after our church was formed. Just to give you a little context of who was living back in that day. And that the nation was only 50 years old at that point. So very, very young nation at the start. So Union Congregational Church formed as a direct result of what is often referred to as the Unitarian controversy. The Unitarian controversy was a significant theological dispute within many congregational churches at that time, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, especially around Boston and eastern Massachusetts. It centered on how people understood the Trinity, the belief in God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Traditional Congregationalists embraced a Trinitarian theology, meaning that they believed in the divinity of Christ. But those who embraced the Unitarian theology rejected the idea of the Trinity. They viewed Jesus as a moral teacher rather than divine. In many congregational churches in this area at that time, the Unitarian perspective was winning the day, including among the clergy. In fact, at our church's 75th anniversary in 1901, James Sidney Allen described this movement in this way. He said, "Many churches in New England had become imbued with Unitarian views to such a degree that the preaching of their ministers was unsatisfactory to Orthodox members. As a result, some in this vicinity withdrew from the east and the west, meaning that members left the First Parish Church in East Bridgewater, which was the big white church on our town common, and members left the First Church in West Bridgewater, both churches having gone the way of Unitarianism. At the 100th anniversary of our church, Miss Mary Castle described it this way. She said that the minister at First Parish in East Bridgewater in the early 1800s came out strongly in favor of Unitarianism against the divinity of Christ, and in consequence, many of the more Orthodox members left the church." Now, you should know that these folks desiring the more traditional theology that were leaving these churches, they didn't all come here and form Union Church. Some of them went and formed the First Congregational Church of Whitman 20 years earlier in 1806. Others went and attended the Congregational Church in North Bridgewater, now known as Brockton, which stayed true to the Orthodox faith. But there were some families right here in our section of town that held their own religious prayer meetings in people's homes at which the more traditional teachings were heard. James Sidney Allen put it this way. He said, "These persons, earnest and devoted Christian men and women, met often for prayer and conference in neighborhood gatherings during a number of years, until at last, being so distant from places of public worship on the Sabbath, they agreed to form a religious society and church by themselves for the community in this place. Accordingly, the necessary legal steps were taken, and a religious society was organized by a justice of the peace on April 29, 1826. It was called the Union Trinitarian Society of East and West Bridgewater. And 3 months later was called the Union Church of East and West Bridgewater. Steps were immediately taken to locate a space to build a church. Pleasant Street had just been opened as a street. For a century or more before, it was only a cart path. And so a modest church was built in our present site. We had 19 founding members, consisting of 11 men and 8 women. You might think that most of those founding members came from the church in East Bridgewater, but that's actually not the case. Only 4 out of the 19 came from the church in East Bridgewater. Most of our founding members, 11 of them, came from First Church in West Bridgewater. 2 came from the church in North Bridgewater and 2 from the church in Plymouth. After the original 19 founding members, many more members were quickly added. There were 21 additional members in that same year of 1826, another 21 members during the next year of 1827, and by the time of their 50th anniversary in 1876, the membership of the church was 361. In order for the church to get on its feet in those very early years, it received aid for several years from the Home Missionary Society. The Home Missionary Society was formed the same year that our church was formed in 1826 by Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Dutch Reformed churches to spread the gospel and support fledgling congregations in the U.S. It provided crucial funds to help new churches hire pastors and become self-sufficient. James Sidney Allen, in his 75th anniversary address, said that this aid has been more than repaid by our later contributions to that society. So that by 75 years later, but I'm sure it's even much sooner than that, it had all been repaid. In those early days, conduct and morals of church members were carefully looked after. Absence from church service required an explanation. And on one occasion, a meeting was called to take action on a member who had attended a theatrical performance. Beginning in 1833, no one could become a member unless they pledged to abstain from the use and distribution of alcohol. Excommunication was handed to one member who changed his beliefs and joined the new church in Elmwood. As James Sidney Allen put it in his address, the church has ever endeavored by kindly watch, care, and discipline to maintain a high standard of morality and Christian character. Each Sunday, there would be a worship service in the morning and the afternoon with a sermon each time. So you're kind of getting that here today. And in between the 2 services, Sabbath school occupied the noon hour. And on Sunday evening, there was a prayer meeting. In addition, there would also be a midweek prayer meeting alternating in different homes. Our first settled pastor, the Reverend Bayless Sanford, was born in Berkeley, Massachusetts. And here's a picture of Bayless, and underneath it says his name there as the first pastor of the church. He was the youngest of 6 sons, 4 of whom became clergymen. He graduated from Brown University in 1823 and was ordained the pastor of our church in 1827 at the age of 26. So we see this picture of Reverend Sanford, which is a picture of an older gentleman, and we don't think of him as starting out here at the age of 26. 3 years later, he married his wife Abby, and they had 11 children. Reverend Sanford was the minister at Union Church for 22 years, which is the longest tenure in our church's history. In a booklet titled A History of East Bridgewater, It was written of him that he was a man of great decision of character and true to his convictions. He was in advance of the community on the great moral questions of the day, in the temperance cause, which was the movement in support of abstinence from alcohol, which was a large movement at that time. In the temperance cause, he took strong grounds on the question of slavery. He gave utterance to ideas which to some were distasteful, but which eventually were looked upon with respect, meaning he was against slavery. His discourses, plain and practical, were carefully studied and of solid worth. In them he endeavored to set forth the whole counsel of God. Though to some he seemed stern, he was in reality genial and kind-hearted. He was a member of the school committee for a longer period than anyone else in the town, and held the office of chairman of that board longer than any other member. The reports which emanated from his pen were replete with good sense and useful suggestions. He will be long remembered and honored for his sterling qualities. In regards to his involvement in the anti-slavery movement, we know that in 1846, the residents of Bridgewater, England, which was the first town in England to abolish slavery, sent a letter to the residents of Bridgewater, Massachusetts, condemning American slavery. In response, in 1847, the residents of Bridgewater, Massachusetts sent a reply affirming their stance against slavery, and we know that Reverend Sanford was selected as one of the drafters of the response because the abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, which was published in Boston in the 1800s, featured this exchange of letters with Reverend Sanford's name. So we can take pride that our founding minister was part of the anti-slavery movement. I also want to touch on Reverend Sanford's involvement in the temperance movement. Some of you have heard me share this before in other history moments. The temperance movement began in the early 1800s with the goal of limiting or even banning consumption of alcoholic beverages. It was a movement rooted in America's Protestant churches, and the Union Temperance Society of East and West Bridgewater was established in 1831 in the Union Congregational Church Meeting House. We know that Reverend Sanford was a strong proponent of the temperance movement because we have in our possession a speech that he gave called a temperance discourse that he delivered before the church membership on a Sunday afternoon in 1848, in which he states the temperance cause presents one of the mightiest instrumentalities for doing good which has ever been put in operation. Those involved in the temperance movement were sometimes referred to as members of the Cold Water Army. In other words, those who advocated for drinking only cold water. As you can imagine, not everybody in East Bridgewater was happy with the temperance movement or the church that was promoting it. And so one night in March of 1839, following a town meeting where measures were considered to restrict the sale of alcohol in the stores and taverns, the Union Church Meeting House was vandalized by those who disagreed with the Union Temperance Society. They painted across the front of the church in big red letters the words, "Cold water, goodbye." It should also be noted that it was during the pastorate of Reverend Sanford that the church was completely destroyed by fire. This occurred between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning on July 28, 1844. The cause was never determined, but it was believed to have been intentionally set. The church immediately proceeded to rebuild on the same site, and so the date on the front of the building is 1844, to mark when our present church building was constructed, as well as to mark the date of the fire that destroyed the original building. After 22 years of ministry under Reverend Sanford, some members became dissatisfied with his leadership, feeling that a change was desirable, and so he was dismissed in September of 1849. As a result, 19 members of the church left with him, and they founded a new Congregational church just down the street on North Central Street at the corner of Elm Street. That's pretty close. The name of the new church was Trinitarian Congregational Church. The Trinitarian Congregational Church, though, did not last long. It dissolved after just 12 years. But our own church's historical literature has a heartwarming note to conclude this particular saga. It says that after the Trinitarian Church was dissolved, Reverend Sanford and his church were welcome again to our fellowship. It's good to hear that there was goodwill and reconciliation there. Although Reverend Sanford did not return as a minister of the church, our records indicate that he was invited to give a speech at the church's 50th anniversary in 1876, when he was 75 years old. Reverend Sanford died at his home in East Bridgewater 40 years later in 1880 at the age of 79. He had lived in East Bridgewater nearly 53 years, and he and some of his family members are buried in the cemetery directly behind the church. I've always thought it was very special that we have a picture of Reverend Bayless Sanford, our founding minister, hanging in the back of our sanctuary. Unfortunately, it was discovered just in recent months that this is not a picture of Reverend Sanford. I don't know how long it's been hanging there. It looks like this is actually Reverend Pearlie Griffin, who was the church's 9th settled minister, serving the church for 10 years, from 1880 to 1890. And he was at the ages of 39 to 49 when he was here. One of his descendants of Reverend Griffin has been in touch with our church about him and sharing photos that they have of him. And these photos look a lot like this photo. I have those photos here in my folder that they gave to me that kind of clued us into this, and I will put it out after this talk, and you can come by and you can kind of compare for yourself what you think. Reverend Griffin actually served in the Civil War prior to his ministry among us, and he too is buried in the cemetery behind our church.
That's great.
Friends, after First Parish Church in the town common was dissolved as a church in the 1980s, Union Church became the oldest active church in East Bridgewater. And we can take great pride in our 200-year history, and so it is good for us to remember our shared story. So thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.